For 5 long years, the name Carolyn Evans was spoken only in hushed tones, wrapped in sorrow and disbelief. She had been the kind of woman who made her presence unforgettable, sharp-witted, ambitious, and unafraid of challenges that scared others. As a licensed pilot who had flown regional aircraft in the United States, Caroline had seemed destined for a career in the skies. But in a single night in Colorado, during what was supposed to be a short hiking retreat, she vanished. No calls, no messages, not even a trace of her belongings beyond a torn jacket found near a cliff. The search that followed was exhaustive. Helicopters scanned ravines. Dogs combed through forest trails, and volunteers marched shoulder to shoulder, calling her name. The Evans family refused to believe she was gone. Her mother placed missing posters in grocery stores and gas stations. Her younger brother searched online forums, begging for tips. But days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and hope slipped into something thinner than air. Caroline's story became another headline, promising young pilot missing in Colorado wilderness. By the 3rd year, the courts declared her legally dead. Insurance was paid, estates were settled, and memorial services were held. Friends gathered in churches and parks, holding photographs of her smiling face, tears streaking their cheeks as they spoke of dreams she would never chase. Caroline had become a ghost in memory, frozen in time, her story locked in past tense. But Caroline Evans was not dead. She had walked away from everything, swallowed by a decision few could imagine making. The truth of her disappearance was not carved into the jagged rocks of Colorado, but etched in her own mind, a truth she had buried deeply and carried across oceans. In the months after her supposed accident, Caroline had slipped into another country, using forged papers and the cover of anonymity. She rented small apartments under different names, worked odd jobs where no questions were asked, and stayed off grids where cameras tracked faces. Her life shrank from ambition to survival. No friends, no family, no attachments. Every smile she offered strangers was rehearsed, every word carefully measured. She often sat by her window at night, staring at city lights in distant lands, wondering if her family still searched for her, if her name still appeared on news tickers, or if she had been folded away into the forgotten pile of the missing. Her hands, once steady on airplane controls, trembled when she thought of the grief she had caused. But she never reached out, never explained. Silence was her choice, even if it hurt. Why? That question haunted her. Caroline's life before her disappearance had not been flawless. Though she wore the uniform of a confident pilot, she carried the weight of personal battles, financial debts she could never untangle, fractured relationships that left her feeling cornered, and an investigation at her airline that hinted at misconduct among senior staff corruption she had stumbled upon by accident. Speaking up would have destroyed powerful careers. Staying silent had nearly crushed her conscience. Trapped between danger and duty, Caroline vanished. To many, she became tragedy. To herself, she became escape. 5 years later, the world had moved on, but Caroline had not. She had grown older, her features sharper, her eyes carrying shadows that once weren't there. She no longer introduced herself with her real name, but when she looked in the mirror, Caroline still stared back. She lived with the paradox of being alive while declared dead, invisible, yet existing. Fate, however, has a cruel sense of timing. On a humid evening in Paris, while working at a small cafe near an airport, Caroline overheard travelers discussing flight schedules. The sound of jets roaring overhead stirred something she had buried. Flying had been her life, her freedom. She could hide from the world, but not from herself. That night she lay awake, listening to the hum of traffic, replaying the sensation of takeoffs, the weight of yokes in her hands, the delicate balance between lift and gravity. She missed the skies more than she admitted. When she eventually boarded a commercial flight again, she did so as a passenger, head down, passport false. She told herself it was just another way to reach a new city, to melt back into the blur of anonymity. But the universe had other plans. That flight would change everything. The aircraft hummed with the routine of travel passengers sliding bags overhead, children fussing, announcements echoing. Caroline sat quietly in row 12, a book unopened in her lap. To her left, a businessman scrolled emails. To her right, a young mother rocked her infant. Everything seemed ordinary, yet the air around her felt charged, as if destiny itself leaned closer. Caroline didn't know that in the cockpit sat Captain Morgan, a man twice her age with decades of flying experience, and his co-pilot, fresh-faced but skilled. She didn't know that only hours into the journey, Morgan's chest would tighten, his body collapsing forward as alarms blared. She didn't know the oxygen masks would fall, passengers would scream, and attendants would race through aisles begging for calm. What she knew, deep in her bones, was that she could never truly escape the skies or the person she once was. Her reappearance was not planned. It was not a confession, nor a staged return to the world that buried her. It was survival, raw and urgent, forced upon her by circumstance. When she rose from row 12, when she stepped forward as passengers watched in disbelief, she carried not only her hidden past, but also the weight of hundreds of lives. The woman declared dead was alive, and she was walking into the cockpit. The flight from New York to London was supposed to be just another line on the airline's schedule, a routine transatlantic crossing carried out countless times every week. Flight 472 carried 287 passengers that night, ranging from weary business travelers to families embarking on vacations. The aircraft, a massive wide-bodied jet, gleamed under the fluorescent lights of the terminal before rolling down the runway and lifting into the sky. Inside, the atmosphere was as ordinary as any long-haul flight. Passengers buckled in, shifted in their seats, and found ways to pass the hours. Some flipped open laptops, determined to finish reports before landing. Others leaned back with headphones, surrendering to music or the soothing hum of engines. Children fussed, their cries blending with the soft instructions of flight attendants, moving down aisles with practiced efficiency. In the cockpit, Captain James Morgan was the image of calm. At 57, with nearly 3 decades of flight experience, Morgan was the kind of pilot passengers dreamed of having calm, meticulous, and unshaken by turbulence or unexpected complications. He had flown through storms, navigated emergency landings, and mentored countless young pilots who looked at him as a father figure. His co-pilot that night, Thomas Reed, was one of those eager professionals, still relatively fresh in the industry, but sharp and eager to learn. "Another smooth crossing," Reed remarked as the plane reached cruising altitude, his tone light and conversational. Morgan chuckled, eyes scanning the instruments. "Don't say that too soon. The skies always have a way of reminding us who's in charge." Reed smiled, jotting notes on his logbook. He admired Morgan's blend of caution and confidence. Flying with him always felt like a masterclass. Hours passed in quiet rhythm. The Atlantic stretched endlessly beneath them, black and moonlit. The cabin settled into silence. Meals had been served, lights dimmed, and most passengers drifted into uneasy sleep. It was in that silence that everything changed. Morgan shifted in his seat, rubbing his chest with a frown. Reed glanced at him, concerned. "You all right, Captain?" Morgan tried to brush it off. "Just indigestion, I think." But his voice was strained, and his hand pressed harder against his sternum. Beads of sweat formed along his hairline. Seconds later, the calm facade cracked. Morgan gasped, his face twisting in pain. His left arm twitched uncontrollably, his breathing shallow and erratic. Reed's eyes widened in horror. "Captain?" His voice rose, urgent. "James?" Before Reed could react, Morgan collapsed forward, slamming against the controls. Alarms blared instantly, red lights flashing across the cockpit panel. The plane jolted slightly, enough to stir a ripple through the cabin. Passengers blinked awake, confused by the sudden shift. "Captain!" Reed shouted again, reaching across to pull Morgan upright. But the older man was unresponsive, his body heavy, eyes rolled back. Reed's pulse thundered in his ears. His training screamed at him to act, but the weight of the situation pressed down with brutal force. He was no longer second in command. He was alone at the controls of a transatlantic flight, with nearly 300 souls on board. In the cabin, confusion swelled. A slight dip in altitude, a faint tremor through the fuselage, and then the mechanical chime that triggered oxygen masks startled everyone. Gasps and shouts erupted. Flight attendants rushed into action. "Please remain calm. Fasten your seatbelts," they instructed, voices loud yet trembling beneath the strain. A few rows back, children began crying, their parents' attempts at reassurance faltering against the sheer unpredictability of the moment. Some passengers clutched armrests, whispering prayers. Others fumbled for phones, trying to send frantic messages while the in-flight Wi-Fi still held. Back in the cockpit, Reed fought to stabilize the plane. He yanked Morgan's body out of the way as best as he could, propping him against the sidewall. His hands shook violently as he adjusted altitude and engaged autopilot. The alarm still screamed, though the jet leveled slightly. "Flight 472 to Atlantic Control," Reed barked into his headset. "We have a medical emergency captain incapacitated. I repeat, captain incapacitated. Request immediate diversion." Static crackled, followed by a firm voice from the ground. "Copy. Flight 472. Stand by. Diverting you to nearest available runway. Please confirm fuel levels and current status." Reed tried to steady his voice as he rattled off numbers, sweat dripping into his eyes. But his panic was raw, unfiltered. He was trained for emergencies, but never had he felt the crushing reality of being alone in command without his captain. Meanwhile, word of the crisis spread through the cabin. Flight attendants moved quickly to find medical personnel among the passengers, dragging equipment toward the cockpit. A doctor and 2 nurses volunteered, squeezing past frightened travelers as they rushed forward. The sight of them only confirmed what everyone already feared. Something was terribly, dangerously wrong. Passengers whispered in dread. "Is the pilot dead? What's happening? Who's flying the plane?" Anxiety fed on itself, growing louder with each unanswered question. It was in that maelstrom of fear that one figure quietly rose from her seat, in row 12. Carolyn Evans. She had watched the commotion unfold with a cold stillness, her mind sharper than her outward calm. For years she had avoided recognition, avoided anything that tied her to the life she once lived. But when the announcements faltered, when the attendants' voices cracked under the weight of panic, Caroline knew the moment she had been running from had found her. Her hands tightened on the armrests as she stood. Her voice cut through the chaos, low but commanding. "I can help. I'm a licensed pilot." The flight attendant nearest to her froze, eyes wide. At first, disbelief clashed with urgency. You're a pilot?" "Yes," Caroline said firmly, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "Get me to the cockpit, now." Gasps spread across the cabin as recognition rippled. A man squinted, his face pale. "That's her," he whispered to his wife. "That's Carolyn Evans, the woman who disappeared. She's supposed to be dead." The words traveled like wildfire, passengers whispering, pointing, their fear twisting into stunned disbelief. But Caroline didn't flinch. She didn't explain. There was no time for her story, no space for the past she carried. Only the present mattered, and the lives hanging in the balance. Guided by trembling attendants, she stepped forward, leaving behind the anonymity she had protected for years. Each stride felt heavier than the last, the weight of hundreds of eyes pressing against her back. The woman declared dead was alive, and she was walking toward the cockpit door. The cabin was in chaos. Flight attendants scrambled to keep passengers calm, but their voices cracked under the weight of fear. The oxygen masks had been retracted, yet the sense of suffocation lingered. The truth whispered its way through the rows. The captain was down. And then Caroline Evans stood. She had not planned it. For years she had avoided moments that drew attention, lived in shadows where no one would look twice at her face. Yet when she rose, every pair of eyes within sight seemed to lock on her, as if pulled by gravity. "I can help," she said, her voice steady, carrying above the din of panic. "I'm a licensed pilot." The nearest flight attendant froze mid-step, blinking as though she had misheard. You're a pilot?" Caroline nodded once. "Yes, get me to the cockpit, now." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Someone dropped a glass that shattered against the floor. A man leaned across the aisle to whisper hoarsely to his wife. "That's her. Caroline Evans, the missing pilot. She's been dead for years." The name spread like wildfire. Caroline Evans. Passengers repeated it, disbelief laced with awe. Some fumbled with phones, searching for her old news photos. And there it was, the same strong jawline, the same piercing eyes, though now hardened by time. It was her. The woman declared dead 5 years ago was alive, standing on a plane where the captain had just collapsed. Whispers turned into questions, questions into shouts. "Is this real? How can she be here? She's lying, isn't she? No, look at her. It's really her." Caroline ignored them. She couldn't afford to explain. Every second wasted was another second closer to disaster. She locked eyes with the attendant again. "Please." "The cockpit." The attendant hesitated, caught between protocol and desperation. But the desperation won. With a sharp nod, she motioned Caroline forward. "This way." As Caroline moved down the aisle, the noise swelled behind her. Some passengers cheered, clinging to the hope she offered. Others recoiled in suspicion, their fear twisting into paranoia. To them, she wasn't salvation. She was a ghost, a question mark, a woman who had vanished and returned without reason. But none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was the locked cockpit door at the end of the narrow passage. Her footsteps slowed as she approached it. Her heart pounded, not just from adrenaline, but from the crushing realization of what she was about to do. For 5 years, she had erased herself from the world. Now, in one act, she would erase the erasure. The attendant pressed the intercom beside the door. "Thomas, we have someone here. She says she's a pilot." A beat of silence followed. Then the co-pilot's voice crackled back, high-pitched with stress. "We don't have time for games." "It's not a game," Caroline said, leaning close to the intercom. "This is Caroline Evans. I flew regional aircraft in the States. I'm type-rated. I know these systems." Another silence, heavier this time. Then, almost a whisper, "That's impossible. You're dead." Caroline's jaw tightened. "Do you want to argue about ghosts, or do you want to land this plane?" The door clicked. Slowly, hesitantly, it opened. The cockpit was a storm of alarms and flashing lights. The captain slumped unconscious against the side wall, his face pale and clammy. The co-pilot, barely keeping it together, looked up with wide, disbelieving eyes as Caroline stepped inside. "You're really her," he muttered. "I am," she replied firmly, sliding into the captain's seat as though no years had passed. Her hands hovered over the controls, trembling for a moment before muscle memory steadied them. "Now focus. Tell me the status." Reed swallowed hard, rattling off altitude, heading, fuel reserves. His words stumbled, but Caroline absorbed them quickly. Her mind sharpened, the old training kicking in like a switch flipped after years of darkness. The weight of the yoke in her hands, the feel of the instrument panel before her, it was like coming home and being tested at the same time. The air smelled of sweat and overheated electronics, the atmosphere thick with fear. Caroline adjusted the autopilot settings, stabilizing the aircraft. "All right," she said, her voice calm, professional. "We've got this." In the cabin, word spread that she had entered the cockpit. Some passengers wept in relief. Others argued bitterly, distrust gnawing at their nerves. "She left her family for 5 years," one woman hissed. "How can we trust her now?" But the alternative was unthinkable. As Caroline steadied the plane, her thoughts flickered to her family, their tears at her memorial, the way they must have cursed her name for vanishing. She couldn't think about that now. Right now, she wasn't the missing woman, the ghost, the secret fugitive. She was a pilot again. The co-pilot looked at her, his fear slowly giving way to awe. "Where have you been?" he asked quietly, almost to himself. Caroline didn't answer. Not yet. Some truths had to wait. Outside, the Atlantic stretched black and endless, the horizon invisible. Inside, every soul on board leaned unknowingly on a woman who had walked out of her grave. The ghost in row 12 had returned, and she had just taken control of the sky. The cockpit felt smaller than Caroline remembered. The panels of switches and glowing screens crowded around her like a jury, each one silently demanding, "Prove yourself." The alarms had faded, the most urgent warnings silenced by the co-pilot, yet tension still crackled in the air like static. She eased into the captain's seat, the leather stiff beneath her, the yoke heavy under her hands. 5 years. It had been 5 years since she touched controls like these, but the feel was immediate, intimate, like an old friend who had waited without judgment. "Status," she ordered. Thomas Reed, the co-pilot, blinked at her, his expression torn between awe and fear. He still wasn't sure whether to trust the living ghost beside him. His voice cracked as he rattled off the numbers. Altitude, 36,000. Heading east-northeast, airspeed steady. Fuel, we've got enough for London plus contingency. Captains. Still unresponsive. No vitals. His hand twitched toward the unconscious man, slumped in the jump seat, but his focus remained on Caroline. Caroline nodded briskly. "Good, keep monitoring." Her voice was steady, professional. It startled Reed how quickly she slipped into command, as though 5 missing years didn't exist. She reached for the headset, sliding it over her ears. The familiar weight pressed against her skull, and with it came a flood of memories she tried to dam up. She pushed the button on the yoke. "Atlantic Control, this is Flight 472. Captain incapacitated. This is Caroline Evans, assuming command." Static filled the line. Then a voice, clipped with disbelief. "Say again?" "This is Caroline Evans," she repeated, her tone sharper. "I am assuming command." Another pause, longer this time, as though the controllers themselves were trying to process the impossible. Everyone in aviation had heard of Caroline Evans, the promising pilot who disappeared in Colorado, the woman whose death certificate had been signed after years of fruitless searches. "Flight 472. Confirm, did you say Caroline Evans?" "I did." She kept her tone cool, though her heart thudded like a drum. "We have nearly 300 passengers. Captain Morgan is unconscious. I need clearance for emergency procedures. The silence that followed wasn't filled with static. It was filled with recognition, with whispered voices on the other side of the radio, scrambling to confirm the identity of the ghost now piloting a commercial jet. Finally, the voice returned, measured but tense. Copy. Flight 472. Stand by. Diverting ground resources. All further instructions will be routed to you. Carolyn, if this is really you, welcome back. Carolyn said nothing. She flicked the cones off, her jaw tightening. Welcome back. As if she had simply been away on holiday, not declared dead for half a decade. Reed stared at her, wide-eyed. You really are her. She kept her gaze on the instruments. Right now, I'm your captain. Focus on your job. He nodded quickly, snapping back to his duties, though curiosity burned in his eyes. Questions pressed at his lips, but he swallowed them. He could ask later if there was a later. Behind the cockpit door, the cabin was buzzing like a hive. Word had spread fast. Carolyn Evans, the woman thought dead, was at the controls. Some passengers cried with relief, convinced destiny had sent them a miracle. Others were suspicious, muttering about imposters and conspiracies. A few filmed shaky videos, broadcasting live to social media. In minutes, the entire world was catching wind of the unbelievable story, unraveling 36,000 feet above the Atlantic. Inside the cockpit, Carolyn forced herself to breathe slowly. Her hands moved across the controls, adjusting trim, recalibrating autopilot. She had flown smaller aircraft before, but the fundamentals were the same. Her fingers remembered what her mind feared it had lost. Every switch clicked beneath her touch with reassuring familiarity. Still, doubt gnawed at her. 5 years without practice. 5 years of silence. Could she still do this? Could she truly command not just the plane, but the trust of everyone behind her? She glanced at the unconscious Captain Morgan. His chest barely rising under the oxygen mask flight attendants had strapped over him. For a flicker of a moment, she wished he would wake up, that he would take control so she wouldn't have to face the world again. But his stillness confirmed what she already knew. This was her burden now. Reed interrupted her thoughts. Control wants us to divert to Heathrow. Weather isn't perfect, but it's the best option. We'll be landing in about 3 hours. Caroline nodded. Plot the course. Let's start descent procedures early. I don't want surprises. He obeyed quickly, fingers flying across the navigation panel. She monitored, correcting where needed. Slowly, his panic eased, soothed by the calm precision in her voice. It felt strange being back, commanding again. It was as though the years had folded in on themselves, compressed into this one extraordinary moment. And yet, beneath the professionalism, Caroline's mind buzzed with the reality of her return. The world knew now. The secret she had carried for so long had been ripped open by circumstance. She hadn't chosen this moment, but destiny had. As the jet hummed steadily through the night, Caroline tightened her grip on the yoke, a steady anchor against the storm inside her. She wasn't the ghost anymore. She was the captain, and she would not fail. The Atlantic stretched below them like an endless sheet of black glass, yet the tranquility was deceptive. Ahead, lightning flashed, illuminating jagged clouds. The storm had been reported, but Carolyn knew firsthand that weather never looked as menacing on a radar screen as it did when you faced it head-on. Reed's voice trembled. That's a big sell. Should we divert north? Caroline studied the display, eyes narrowing. Her instincts screamed that cutting north would put them in stronger headwinds and cost valuable fuel. Negative. We'll thread it. Adjust heading 2 degrees east. Trust the gap. Reed hesitated, then complied. Her hands were steady, but inside her chest, Her heart thudded like a war drum. The storm outside wasn't the only one she was navigating. Ever since she had pressed that radio button and announced her name, the past had been clawing at the edges of her mind. The cabin of the small plane in Colorado, the sudden engine stall, the freezing wind as she crawled from the wreckage. And the years after, when she had disappeared into a shadowed existence, she wasn't ready to explain. She had thought she could hide forever. Fate had other plans. A rumble of turbulence jolted the aircraft. Overhead bins rattled, and muffled gasps echoed from the cabin. Caroline braced the yoke, correcting smoothly. The jet bucked, then steadied. "Seatbelt sign on," she instructed. Reed flicked the switch, his throat dry. Cabin's already panicking. "The purser says people are praying out loud." Caroline allowed herself a brief exhale. Fear in the cabin was natural, but fear in the cockpit was fatal. And let them pray. Our job is to fly. The storm flared again, white light streaking across the nose of the jet. For a moment, it lit Caroline's profile in stark relief calm, determined yet haunted. Reed stole a glance at her. She looked like someone carrying a weight far heavier than a jet full of passengers. Meanwhile, the world below had turned its eyes skyward. News stations had broken into live coverage, broadcasting shaky phone videos from inside the plane. Millions were watching as anchors repeated the unbelievable headline. Caroline Evans, declared dead for 5 years, was alive and piloting Flight 472. Commentators speculated wildly, some calling it a miracle. Others spinning theories of espionage or staged death. In living rooms across America and Europe, families sat frozen, watching history unfold. Caroline's parents, aged by grief, clutched each other in their small Kansas home as the daughter they had buried by proxy was suddenly alive on their television screen. Her former colleagues, scattered across the industry, stared at their phones in disbelief. And in government offices, officials scrambled to understand how a dead woman had reappeared in the cockpit of a transatlantic jet. None of that reached Caroline, not directly. But through the comms, she felt the pressure. Flight 472, Atlantic Control, the voice crackled. "We've got multiple agencies requesting confirmation. They want details where you've been. What happened? Can you respond?" Caroline pressed her lips together, her eyes fixed on the glowing instruments. The lightning flashed again, thunder rumbling faintly even at this altitude. She keyed the mic. "Negative. My priority is this aircraft. No further details until we're on the ground." Her voice was clipped, cold steel. There would be time for explanations later if they survived. Reed gave her a sidelong glance. He wanted to ask, to pry into the mystery, but something in her tone silenced him. Whatever story lay behind her resurrection, it was locked tight. Another pocket of turbulence hit, sharper this time. The plane shuddered violently, dropping what felt like several feet. A ripple of screams tore from the cabin. Oxygen masks swayed overhead, unused but ominous. Caroline's hands gripped the yoke with precision. She rode the turbulence like a surfer, not fighting it too hard, letting the aircraft move with the air currents rather than against them. Slowly, the shaking eased. "Altitude steady," she muttered. "Engines stable. We're through the worst." Reed wiped his forehead, sweat beading despite the cool cockpit air. "You make it look natural." She gave a small, humorless laugh. "Flying is the only place I ever belonged." Her eyes flicked briefly toward the dark horizon, where dawn threatened to paint the sky with gray. The rest of life? That's harder. For a moment, silence filled the cockpit, heavy with the unspoken. Reed wanted to press, to ask how a dead woman could walk back into the sky, but the storm demanded focus, and Caroline gave it every ounce of hers. Behind them, The passengers had settled into uneasy silence. Some clutched rosaries, others scrolled frantically through their phones. Rumors spread like wildfire. Was Caroline Evans really who she claimed? Had the airline allowed a fraud to take control? Or was this divine providence, a pilot returned from the grave to save them? In seat 14A, a young girl pressed her face to the window, staring out at the flashing lightning, whispering to her mother, "She's not dead. She's an angel." Caroline, unaware of the whispers and theories, leaned back slightly in her seat as the jet cleared the storm front. Ahead, calmer skies stretched toward Europe. Relief loosened her shoulders, but only a fraction. They weren't safe, yet not until wheels touched the runway. She keyed the radio once more. "Control, Flight 472, storm navigated. Course steady for Heathrow. Request emergency landing priority." The reply was immediate, tinged with urgency. "Priority granted. Runway will be cleared. Fire and medical crews are standing by." Caroline gave a firm nod. "Copy." The co-pilot leaned back, finally allowing himself a shaky sigh. "You're really going to get us there?" Caroline didn't answer. She wasn't ready to promise anything. She only knew one thing for certain. She had been thrust into this moment for a reason. Whether it was fate, chance, or some cruel twist of destiny, she would see it through. Lightning flashed one last time behind them, fading into the distance. The storm of clouds had passed, but inside Caroline, the storm of secrets was only beginning to churn. She could hide from the world no longer. The truth would demand to be spoken. But first, she had a plane to land. The first light of dawn spilled across the horizon, painting the Atlantic in streaks of silver. For hours, the passengers of Flight 472 had lived in the twilight of fear and disbelief, their fate bound to the woman in the cockpit who should not have existed. Now, as the jet cut toward England, anticipation grew sharper than terror. Caroline adjusted her headset, eyes fixed on the flight display. Every beeping instrument, every blinking light became part of a rhythm she had once lived by. The familiarity was comforting, yet it was poisoned with doubt. 5 years gone. 5 years out of the sky. Could she still bring this aircraft home? London Control. Her voice was steady, though her pulse raced. "This is Flight 472, requesting vectors for emergency landing." The reply came immediately, calm but laden with gravity. "Flight 472, you are cleared for priority descent. Runway 27R will be cleared. All emergency services are standing by." She could almost picture it. Fire trucks lined along the tarmac, ambulances idling, spotlights and cameras already waiting. The world had been watching their approach for hours. Every second of their descent would be scrutinized by millions. "Roger," she said. "Beginning descent." Reed glanced at her nervously. "You really haven't flown a commercial jet in years?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Not since before." "Everything. And you're sure you can? Do your job, Reed," she snapped, though not cruelly. Her tone was sharp, because hesitation was dangerous. "Run descent checklist." He obeyed quickly, calling out each item, his trembling voice steadier with each confirmation. The familiarity of the process reassured him, even if the surreal weight of who sat beside him gnawed at his thoughts. Caroline guided the yoke, initiating the descent. The engines roared lower, the nose tipping gently down. The plane responded with grace, but her muscles tensed with every adjustment. She remembered the training simulator drills, the endless repetition of procedures. Muscle memory hadn't abandoned her, but this wasn't training. This was 300 lives, and her own redemption, balanced on the edge of a runway. Behind the cockpit door, tension simmered. The passengers had grown quiet, their fear giving way to exhausted silence. Some clutched loved ones, others whispered prayers. A few still filmed with trembling hands, capturing history in shaky frames. They all knew the landing would decide everything, whether Caroline Evans was a miracle returned or a ghost doomed to fail. In seat 22B, an elderly man muttered, "She's got the hands of fate now." His wife squeezed his hand, whispering back, "She wouldn't be here if it wasn't meant to be." On the ground, Heathrow braced for impact. News crews jostled for position outside the airport perimeter, their cameras trained on the dark speck approaching through the pale dawn. Emergency crews lined the runway, every man and woman aware that this landing would be remembered for decades. Officials in control towers murmured to one another, unable to reconcile the impossible truth. Caroline Evans, declared legally dead, was guiding a commercial jet to their runway. Caroline's mind raced, not with thoughts of fame or headlines, but with ghosts. She saw again the wreckage in the Colorado mountains, the flames licking the snow, her breath freezing as she stumbled into the wilderness. She remembered the choice she had made to vanish, to cut herself off from the world, from her family, from the cockpit that defined her. She had buried Caroline Evans, convinced the world was better without her. But the sky had called her back. "Flaps 10, she ordered. Reed complied, hands moving quickly. The mechanical whir vibrated through the fuselage as the flaps extended. The aircraft slowed, its body adjusting to the coming approach. "Speed?" she asked. 250 and dropping, Reed confirmed. She nodded. "Good. Keep it steady." The runway was still distant, hidden beneath the haze of morning light, but Caroline could feel it like a pulse in the earth, calling her closer. The descent was smooth so far, but she knew the real test was still ahead. Final approach was always the crucible, the moment where skill, instinct, and nerves collided. The radio crackled again. "Flight 472, Control. Be advised your landing is being monitored at the highest level. The Prime Minister has been briefed. Global media is live." Caroline didn't flinch. "Copy," she replied coolly. She refused to give them the satisfaction of hearing fear in her voice. Reed gave her a wide-eyed glance. "The whole world's listening." She tightened her grip on the yoke. "Then let's give them something worth hearing." Altitude ticked down 15,000 feet, 12,010. The engines roared softer, the aircraft gliding lower through layers of thin cloud. Patches of green fields appeared far below, stitched with winding roads and rivers that shimmered in the dawn. Caroline's breathing slowed, controlled. Each adjustment was precise, almost surgical. Despite the years, the plane responded as though she had never left. The cockpit wasn't just a machine door, it was alive, an extension of herself. Read off the numbers. 9,000 feet. Airspeed 180. Descent on target. Caroline gave a single nod. Her eyes narrowed on the horizon. Somewhere beyond the thinning clouds lay the strip of tarmac that would decide her fate. In the cabin, silence gave way to murmurs. Some passengers pressed their faces to windows, watching the ground rise to meet them. Others closed their eyes, bracing for the unknown. The weight of collective breath hung heavy in the recycled air. Caroline's voice cut through the tension. Calm, commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your acting captain. We are beginning our descent into Heathrow. Please remain seated with your belts fastened. We will be on the ground shortly." Her words spread like a ripple through the cabin. For many, it was the first time they had truly believed she could bring them home. Back in the cockpit, Caroline's jaw clenched. Gear down. Reed moved the lever, and with a deep groan, the landing gear deployed. 3 green, he confirmed. She nodded again, her eyes locked ahead. The horizon shifted, revealing at last the faint glimmer of runway lights, piercing the dawn. Her chest tightened. That strip of asphalt was more than just a landing, it was judgment. Success meant survival and vindication. Failure meant headlines etched in tragedy. 5,000 feet, Reed announced. Speed 150. Flaps 20. Caroline's hands steadied the yoke, her breathing measured. The runway grew larger in the windshield, each passing second magnifying the pressure. She could almost hear the world holding its breath. In that moment, the cockpit felt both impossibly small and boundless. A capsule of silence, hurtling toward destiny. Caroline knew the next few minutes would define her forever. The descent continued. The ground loomed closer. The runway lights burned brighter. She whispered, too soft for Reed to hear, "I wasn't meant to stay dead." The runway lights stretched ahead like a beacon, glowing against the dim dawn. To the passengers, they were salvation. To Caroline, they were a test, the moment that would decide whether she was a ghost clinging to the past or a pilot reborn. 2,000 feet, Reed announced, his voice taut. Speed 140. Glide slope on path. Caroline's hands gripped the yoke firmly, knuckles pale, but her eyes were steady. Every muscle remembered this moment, the tension of descent, the judgment of gravity. The aircraft shuddered lightly in crosswinds, but her corrections were precise, almost instinctive. Wind shear warning. The computer blared suddenly, its voice cold and merciless. The plane jolted hard to the left, tilting just enough to send passengers gasping. Coffee cups toppled, seatbelts strained. A chorus of frightened cries filled the cabin. Countering, Caroline muttered, guiding the yoke with deliberate force. Her hands moved with calm precision, pushing against the invisible fists of turbulent air. The aircraft steadied, but the storm wasn't done. Airspeed fluctuating, Reed warned. 130 to 150 spikes. Ride it, she replied. Trust the glide. Her pulse hammered, yet her voice stayed smooth. That steadiness, that unshakable authority, spread like fire. Reed's breathing slowed. Even the cabin crew, gripping jump seats in fear, felt a thread of confidence coil through them. Outside, the sky opened to the sight of Heathrow's tarmac, fire trucks gleaming red along the runway edges, ambulances waiting with sirens silent but ready. Cameras zoomed in, broadcasting live across the world. Millions of eyes were watching, waiting for either a miracle or catastrophe. 500 feet, Reed called. His hands trembled on the throttle, awaiting her command. Caroline inhaled slowly. Her eyes flicked across the panel. Airspeed, descent rate, wind angle, every detail seared into her awareness. This was no longer about her past, or the 5 lost years. This was pure flying. This was life reduced to numbers, instinct, and control. Stabilized, she said. Commit to landing. Reed swallowed hard. Committed. The jet roared lower. Wheels hung ready, flaps full. Passengers braced, some gripping armrests until their knuckles blanched, others whispering prayers into the recycled air. A little girl buried her face into her mother's side, too young to understand, but old enough to feel the weight of fear. 200 feet, Reed called, his voice nearly breaking. The plane bucked again, slammed by another gust. The nose pitched slightly high, alarms blaring. Don't fight it, Caroline murmured. She coaxed the yoke, easing the aircraft back to balance, wings trembling but level. She wants to fly. Let her. For a heartbeat, the runway seemed to slip away, the jet wobbling on the edge of disaster. Screams erupted in the cabin. Even Reed let out an involuntary curse. But Caroline's eyes never left the center line. Her grip was steady, her will absolute. She leaned into the storm, coaxing the jet back into its descent path with the precision of a surgeon's hand. 100 feet, Reed barked. sweat dripping down his temple. Carolyn whispered, not to Reed, not to the passengers, but to herself. "Come on, girl. Bring us home." The jet descended like a held breath, engines roaring, the ground rushing to meet them. 50 feet. Caroline pulled gently on the yoke, flaring the nose. The wheels hovered mere feet from the asphalt. Crosswinds slammed again, shoving them sideways. The left wing dipped alarmingly close to the runway. Gasps turned to shrieks in the cabin. Reed's hand twitched on the throttle. "We should go around." "No," Carolyn cut him off sharply. "We land." Her muscles strained as she corrected, nose aligned, wings leveling by fractions of a degree. Every nerve in her body burned. 30 feet. The wheels kissed asphalt with a thunderous screech. The jet bounced once, hard, alarms wailing. For a split second, disaster threatened, a tail strike, a veer, a skid into flames. Caroline held steady, refusing panic. She coaxed the yoke, guiding the beast as if soothing a frightened horse. The second contact was smoother, firmer. The wheels gripped. The landing gear groaned under the weight, but they held. Reverse thrust. She commanded. Reed slammed the levers. The engines roared in reverse, a deafening howl shaking the fuselage. The jet shuddered violently as speed bled away. Passengers were thrust forward against belts, cries mixing with gasps of relief. The runway streaked past in blurs of lights and asphalt. Fire trucks loomed in peripheral vision, ready to chase if flames erupted. Caroline's focus was absolute. She wrestled the yoke, coaxing the heavy craft to stay aligned on the center line. Tires screamed but held firm. The roaring deceleration pressed her chest against the straps, until finally, the plane slowed, the beast submitting to her hands. 70 knots, Reed gasped. 60, 40. Caroline eased the brakes, her arms trembling now that adrenaline bled into fatigue. The jet rolled to a stop at last, its engines whirring into idle. Its massive frame trembling but safe. Silence. For a moment. The cockpit was filled only with the hiss of cooling systems and the faint tick of settling metal. Then, from behind the cockpit door, it came the eruption. Applause, cheers, sobs of relief. Passengers clapping, crying, embracing strangers with trembling arms. It rolled through the cabin like a wave, disbelief crashing into gratitude. Reed leaned back, exhaling a laugh that was half hysteria. "We're alive. You actually did it." Caroline stared ahead, her hands still gripping the yoke. The runway lights blurred through unshed tears she didn't realize had formed. She had done it, brought them home. Against time, against fate, against death itself. The radio crackled to life. Flight 472, Heathrow Tower, welcome home. Her lips parted, but no words came. The weight of 5 lost years pressed against her chest. Home. Could it still be hers? She lifted her trembling hand from the yoke and pressed the come button. Tower, this is Flight 472. On the ground. Request medical for the captain. Passengers safe. The voice replied with quiet reverence. Copy, 472. Carolyn Evans. The world is watching. And they're cheering. Her throat tightened. She wasn't ready for the world. Not yet. But for the first time in 5 years, she had given something back. In the cabin, the applause thundered louder, passengers chanting her name. Caroline sat still, silent, letting it wash over her. She wasn't sure she deserved it. But in this moment, she wasn't the ghost anymore. She was the captain. The wheels of Flight 472 finally settled into the calm tarmac of Heathrow, the massive jet breathing a sigh of release after its hours of suspended terror. Fire trucks flanked the runway, engines idling, lights flashing in ceremonial solidarity. Emergency crews surged forward, ready for medical evaluation, but the moment had already taken on surreal, almost mythical quality. Inside the cabin, passengers stared in disbelief at the reality of survival. Some collapsed against seats, their bodies trembling from the adrenaline that had kept them upright. Others clasped hands with neighbors they barely knew, whispering prayers of thanks. A few simply stared out the windows, watching the runway lights fade as the storm behind them gave way to calm morning skies. Caroline remained in the cockpit for a moment longer, letting Reed coordinate the final shutdown. Her hands hovered over the controls, the familiar panel glowing softly, and she allowed herself a single exhale long, deliberate, a release of tension she hadn't realized she'd been holding for hours. "Flight 472, Reed said quietly. "We did it." Caroline nodded, her eyes distant. "We did what had to be done." The cockpit door opened, and passengers and crew slowly began filing out, their faces a mixture of awe, gratitude, and lingering fear. Cameras flashed, reporters surged forward, and the world waited. Somewhere beyond the airport perimeter, millions were watching a woman declared dead 5 years ago step from a plane alive and triumphant. Caroline Evans emerged first, her expression unreadable. She could feel every gaze on her, every whisper of disbelief and praise. The press shouted questions, their voices overlapping. "Ms. Evans, where have you been? Why did you disappear? How did you know what to do? Are you going to explain you're 5 years away?" She lifted a hand, calling for calm. The questions tumbled over one another, yet she addressed none of them directly. "Please," she said softly but firmly, "we can speak after everyone is safe. My priority is the passengers and crew. They are all okay." For a few moments, the mob of reporters hesitated, stunned by her composure, the authoritative calm of a woman who had returned from the impossible. Every instinct in Caroline screamed at her to remain silent, to protect the secrets of her disappearance. She could see the curiosity, the judgment, the hunger for answers, but she would not give it to them, not yet. The passengers began disembarking, one by one, some hugging her as she passed. "You saved us," a woman whispered, tears streaking her face. A little boy tugged her sleeve, saying, "I knew you weren't dead." The words were innocent, yet they cut deeper than the thousands of questions screaming from microphones. She nodded at each one, a silent acknowledgement. Outside, Caroline's family waited, her mother, father, and younger brother, faces drawn by years of grief and hope mingled in impossible ways. Her mother's eyes widened, disbelief giving way to tears that streamed freely down her cheeks. Her father's jaw tightened, and then softened as he opened his arms. Her brother's hands shook as he reached forward. Caroline paused. 5 years had passed since they had mourned her, celebrated her absence with finality. She had abandoned them, left them bereft. And yet, here they were, arms extended, waiting to close the gap of impossible time. Tears pooled in her eyes, unbidden. She stepped forward, letting herself be caught in their embrace. The moment was heavy with all she hadn't said, all the apologies she would never fully speak aloud. Words failed her, yet in their embrace, forgiveness, or at least understanding, began to form. Authorities approached, clipboard in hand, faces a mix of suspicion and awe. Questions about her disappearance would follow, as would investigations into her re-entry into the world. But for now, Caroline's priority was simple: safety and humanity. "Captain Evans," one officer said quietly, "will need a full report on the flight, your certification, and your story of the past 5 years." She nodded once. "I will cooperate." But after everyone is accounted for, the press swirled, still shouting, still capturing every moment. Caroline's lips pressed into a thin line. She could feel the weight of her legend building in real time, the miraculous return of a woman declared dead, a pilot who had navigated life and death with unerring skill. She had become myth. But myths always carried a shadow, and Carolyn knew hers was just beginning to emerge. Questions would come. Scrutiny would follow. Some would praise her, others vilify her. And she would have to face the consequences of 5 years erased from the world, of choices made in isolation, of secrets kept too long. She exhaled, letting the cool morning air wash over her. The engines of Flight 472 were silent now, but the world hummed around her. One of the passengers, a young mother, caught her eye. "You're human, right?" she asked softly. Caroline allowed herself the barest smile. "Yes, human," she admitted. "Just like you." For the first time in years, Caroline felt that fragile, terrifying thing, the weight of life returning to her fully. She had been declared dead, and yet here she stood, living, breathing, accountable, and responsible. She had faced the impossible, and now the impossible had faced her. And she had survived. Later, as she walked away from the jet, authorities escorting her toward a waiting vehicle, she glanced back at the aircraft. Flight 472 would forever be marked by that day, the day the world watched a ghost come alive and claim her rightful place in the sky. Caroline thought of the years she had hidden, the roads she had walked alone, the skies she had missed. Those years had shaped her, hardened her, and haunted her. But they had not broken her. She had returned. She had flown. And now, finally, she could step back into a world that had long thought her lost. The cameras would capture every moment. The reporters would write every detail. The authorities would demand explanations. But Carolyn knew one thing that no one else could. She had faced her storm, and she had landed safely. And that was enough for now. Her next chapter awaited, unknown and uncharted, but grounded in one undeniable truth. She was alive, unbroken, and finally free.